For decades, millions of American families settled into their living rooms every Saturday night and watched the same man give them the same thing. Bubbles rising gently through the air, a smiling band in matching jackets, polished dancers, and music so clean it felt like it had been washed and pressed before broadcast. Lawrence Welk was not just a television host. He was a feeling, a weekly ritual, a warm promise that somewhere in the world, everything was still orderly, cheerful, and decent. America loved him for it. He had the accent, the smile, the careful manners, and a show that felt like a handshake from a simpler time. But when researchers began opening the boxes stored in the Lawrence Welk collection at North Dakota State University, and when archivists started pulling contracts, letters, personal records, and business documents from the collections preserved at the Los Angeles Public Library, a far more complicated picture began to emerge. The documents left behind by Welk and his associates tell stories that were never broadcast on Saturday night. Stories about power, money, race, control, and the carefully constructed distance between the man on screen and the man behind the curtain. What those archives contained was not a monster, but it was not the gentle grandfather with the accordion, either. It was something far more interesting and far more human than that. The story begins, as Welk himself always insisted, in hardships so severe that most people today would struggle to imagine it. He was born on March 11, 1903, in Strasburg, North Dakota, to Ludwig and Christina Welk, German-speaking Catholic immigrants, whose family had originally come from the Alsace-Lorraine region of Europe by way of Odessa, in what is now Ukraine. The Welk family arrived in North Dakota in 1892, and their first winter on the Great Plains was nearly fatal. Temperatures plunged to brutal lows. Blizzards tore across the open land, and the family had no proper shelter waiting for them. They reportedly survived their first weeks huddled beneath their upturned covered wagon, packing sod bricks around it for insulation against the screaming wind. 8 people shared that cramped, freezing space for weeks, surviving on frozen jerky while neighbors around them fell to cold, hunger, and disease. The Welks endured by digging for roots and trapping whatever animals they could find. That story was passed down through the family like scripture, and it lived in Lawrence's bones long after the prairies were far behind him. As a child, Lawrence Welk spoke only German at home. School, conducted in English, was a bewildering and humiliating experience. He sat through lessons he could barely follow, understanding fragments, guessing at the rest. By the time he had reached the 4th grade, his formal education was finished. He was 10 years old and fully committed to farm labor, milking cows before dawn in freezing temperatures, plowing fields with nervous horses, hauling water from a distant creek, fixing tools in the blacksmith shop, and doing the unrelenting physical work of a grown man while still a boy. His father, Ludwig, was strict and demanding. Laziness brought punishment quickly. The prairie did not forgive weakness, and neither did Ludwig Welk. On the surface, it looked like a life with no future beyond the dirt. No education, barely any English, no reason to believe that anything grander was possible. But something was growing beneath all that labor and discipline, something that hard work had accidentally built alongside the muscles and the calluses. Music opened the door. At the barn dances that punctuated the long, grinding weeks of farm life, farmers gathered after exhausting days of work to drink homemade whiskey, stomp their boots, and spin across dusty floors under lantern light. Lawrence's father, Ludwig, played an old push-button accordion at these gatherings, and it was at one of these dances that the young boy first touched the instrument's keys. The sound it produced, the feeling of the crowd responding, the way the music seemed to lift the room out of its exhaustion. It ignited something in Lawrence Welk that he would spend the rest of his life feeding. He began teaching himself on homemade and borrowed instruments, learning by instinct, failing repeatedly, and returning each time because the pull of music was stronger than the embarrassment of failure. When Lawrence was a teenager, he struck one of the most consequential bargains of his life. He asked his father for a mail-order accordion that cost $400, a staggering sum for a struggling farming family, the kind of money that represented months of difficult labor. His father agreed, but the terms were hard. Lawrence would work the family farm without wages until his 21st birthday, and every penny he earned from music during those years would go directly back into the family's hands. He accepted without hesitation because he wanted that instrument more than he wanted anything else in his life. He practiced until his fingers blistered. He learned by force and repetition and pure stubbornness. He began slipping away to play at local dances, weddings, and small community gatherings. And the crowds noticed his raw, unstoppable energy even when his playing was still rough around the edges. On March 11, 1924, Lawrence Welk turned 21. The bargain with his father was fulfilled. He packed the accordion into its worn case, put on his one good jacket, reportedly tucked 3 single-dollar bills inside the lining for emergencies, and walked away from North Dakota. He had almost no money, an accent so thick it made introductions awkward, and no map for what came next. But he had something that the prairie had spent 21 years pressing into him without intending to, an absolute refusal to quit. He boarded a train and disappeared into the wider world, carrying nothing except nerve, a work ethic that most people around him would never be able to match, and the unshakable belief that music could carry him further than the plow ever would. The early years were rough in ways that would have broken someone with less iron in their spine. He slept wherever he could, ate when he found food, and played in small halls and road houses for whatever he could get. Some crowds liked him and some did not, and at least one rowdy audience responded to a botched performance by throwing bottles in his direction. That kind of humiliation could have sent him home. Instead, it pushed him deeper into the life he had chosen. He found his way into traveling vaudeville outfits and cheap road shows across the Midwest, including a group where a promoter marketed him with a breathtaking lie, calling him the world's greatest accordion player. Lawrence knew it was nonsense. He was still rough, still awkward, still stumbling through English. But the lie forced him to rise. Crowds expected greatness, so he practiced until he began to resemble the thing he had been falsely advertised as. What started as shameless promotion slowly turned into genuine skill. He kept moving, leading small bands with desperate names chosen to catch attention in a crowded entertainment market, the Hotsy Tootsie Boys, the Honolulu Fruit Gum Orchestra. Strange names that were not confidence but survival, a man chasing work in any direction that opened. A turning point arrived in 1924 when his small group passed through Yankton, South Dakota, and crossed paths with WNEX Radio. The station manager heard them play and pulled them in for an immediate live audition. They were dusty, underprepared, and broke, but they played anyway. Lawrence's accordion rang out, his thick accent tangled up the introductions, and somehow the whole thing connected with the farmers tuning in across the region. Letters came in. The station offered them a 1-week job, and that 1 week stretched into years. Through radio, Welk reached audiences far beyond the barns and community halls where he had started. He also met Fern Renner there, the woman who would become his wife. That accident of geography and timing changed everything. Instead of remaining a wandering musician sleeping in borrowed rooms, he became a regional figure with a growing following, a man who had stopped drifting and started building. As the years passed, Lawrence Welk kept learning the lesson that would eventually make him famous. He was never going to win by sounding like everyone else. In an entertainment world where swing bands chased heat, volume, and the latest trends, he leaned toward polish, warmth, and control. Every musician in his group was drilled. Every arrangement was rehearsed to a standard that left no room for sloppiness. The result was a smooth, disciplined sound that kept dancers on the floor and listeners coming back. Then in 1940, when he appeared at Chicago's Trine Ballroom, one of the most respected dance venues in the country, a stage where Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey had already ruled, a woman in the audience told him his music sounded light and bubbly, like champagne. Lawrence Welk did not forget it. He took that passing remark and turned it into a brand. Champagne music became the center of everything. The identity, the image, the promise he was making to his audience week after week. While others chased bebop and experimental jazz, and whatever sound critics were celebrating that season, Welk went the other way entirely. He held on to waltzes, polkas, and familiar melodies that felt like home to people who did not want to be challenged. Critics laughed. Industry insiders dismissed him as hopelessly old-fashioned. But he had seen something they missed, a vast audience of ordinary Americans who wanted comfort, not complexity. and who would remain loyal to anyone willing to give it to them without apology. By 1951, live big band work was fading across the country, and Welk made a move that most musicians considered risky, bordering on reckless. He packed up his 22-piece band, drove across the country to Los Angeles, and bet his future on television, a medium that many established musicians still regarded as a passing gimmick. KTLA gave him a weekly live show from the Aragon Ballroom in Venice Beach, but there was a significant catch. He had to contribute to the filming cost himself, which meant risking his own savings on something entirely unproven. He did it anyway. The show began on May 11, 1951, and the response came fast. Local audiences packed the ballroom. Viewers sent floods of letters. His clean, cheerful, carefully controlled style found the devoted television audience it had always been looking for. For 4 years, he built that local following while the television industry around him shifted and fought through its own power struggles. Then, in 1955, ABC gave him a national platform under the title Dodge Dancing Party. His reach exploded overnight. Suddenly, millions of viewers across America were watching the same farm boy who had once struggled through school without understanding a word of English. The sponsors arrived. The record sold. The empire began to take shape in earnest. What the business records and financial documents in the archives reveal is that the empire was far more elaborate than the show's warm, homespun image suggested. In 1955, Welk established Teleclue Productions. The name is simply Welk, spelled backward, to produce his own television program and manage his growing portfolio of interests. In 1967, he co-founded Ranwood Records with industry veteran Randy Wood, and crucially, he negotiated the return of the masters to all of his previous recordings from Dot and Coral Records. That catalog, which he later purchased outright in 1979 when he bought Wood's share of the company, became an asset that generated royalty income for decades. He invested in Champagne Towers in Santa Monica, a development that included a 16-story apartment building and a 21-story office tower with ocean views. He built Lawrence Welk Village in Escondido, a resort, golf course, and retirement community developed on land he purchased in 1970 for approximately $3.2 million, which grew into something worth vastly more. By the time of his death in 1992, his estate was valued at roughly $150 million. The musicians in his band, meanwhile, earned around union-scale wages, decent work, but a universe away from the wealth their employer was quietly accumulating. The gentle host who spoke on camera about family and gratitude was also off-camera, one of the most methodical accumulators of assets in the history of American entertainment. That need for control extended far beyond the balance sheet. Musicians who worked for Welk later described an atmosphere of cheerful strictness that ran through every aspect of the show. There were rules about behavior, rules about appearance, rules about performance. No one was to arrive late. No one was to cause a scandal in their private life that might bleed into the show's pristine public image. No one was to outshine the machine that Lawrence Welk had built. He expected total professionalism, and beneath that expectation, something closer to total obedience. He had worked too hard and waited too long to allow any piece of his carefully constructed world to slip out of alignment. That is the context in which the departure of Alice Lon must be understood. Lon had joined the show in 1955 as its first champagne lady, and she quickly became one of the most beloved figures on American television. Her warm Texas charm, her rich alto voice, her easy stage presence. Viewers adored her, and her popularity was reflected in the thousands of letters that arrived at the studio every week. For 4 seasons, she was as central to the show's appeal as the champagne music itself. But her popularity came with a problem. The more the audience loved Alice Lon, the more Lawrence Welk had to watch someone else become a primary reason they tuned in. And for a man who had built his entire world around controlling every variable, that was never going to sit comfortably. The official explanation that circulated after her departure in 1959 was that Welk had dismissed her for showing too much knee during a performance, a reason so trivial that many viewers and television commentators found it almost impossible to take seriously. Contemporary newspaper accounts, including Lon's own statements to the press at the time, pointed toward a more substantive conflict involving musical direction and compensation. She wanted to sing different material. She wanted to be paid more in line with her contribution to the show's success. Welk reportedly received these requests as challenges to his authority rather than reasonable professional negotiations. And when Lon indicated she was prepared to leave over the dispute, a letter from his management arrived confirming that her resignation had been accepted. Thousands of protest letters poured into ABC. Some viewers contacted sponsors directly. Critics on radio programs and in newspapers called the decision petty, hypocritical, and punishing to a woman who had given the show for years of exceptional work. Welk reportedly reached out privately to ask Lon to return. She refused. She had not spent 4 years building her reputation to accept humiliation gracefully, and she was not going to begin now. She rebuilt her career on her own terms, recording music, performing on radio, working in Texas and Las Vegas, until her death in 1981 at the age of 54. She died from scleroderma, a rare autoimmune disease. She never returned to the show that had made her famous. Race brought another quiet tension into Welk's world, and the documentary record surrounding it is one of the most historically significant aspects of what the archives reveal. In 1964, a tap dancer named Arthur Duncan joined the Lawrence Welk Show and became, according to historical documentation, including records at the Library of Congress, the first African American to serve as a regular performer on a sponsored national television variety program. The significance of that fact was enormous. The silence with which the show treated it was almost equally enormous. Welk introduced Duncan warmly, praised his dancing enthusiastically, and kept him employed on national television for 18 years. But neither Welk nor his show ever made a speech about what Arthur Duncan's presence meant in a country where the civil rights movement was reshaping the social landscape in real time. The barrier Duncan had crossed simply went unacknowledged week after week, as if the history happening in plain sight did not need to be named. Duncan had already paid a price for appearing on television once before. His regular appearances on The Betty White Show in 1954 had triggered angry letters and boycott threats from segregated Southern affiliates who objected to a black performer sharing the screen with white cast members. Betty White refused to remove him, delivering a response that became memorable. He was staying, and viewers could live with it. The show was subsequently canceled, and many close to the situation believed that pressure from nervous Southern affiliates and anxious sponsors had played a significant role in that decision. Duncan moved on, carrying that experience with him. When he arrived on the Lawrence Welk Show a decade later, he was entering a place that offered steady work and a national audience, but not full recognition of what his presence represented. Dance historian Constance Vallis Hill has documented that in an era when black and white performers did not hold hands on national television, Duncan was often positioned carefully apart from white female cast members during ensemble numbers. The unspoken rules of American television in the 1960s shaped where he stood on the stage, even as he stood there breaking barriers. He did not make speeches about it. He simply kept dancing, kept performing, kept delivering flawless work every single week for 18 years, and let his endurance be its own kind of statement. When he died in January 2023 at the age of 97, historians and archivists had long since caught up to the magnitude of what he had done, a recognition that the show itself had never quite given him while the cameras were rolling. In 1971, ABC made a decision that seemed strategically rational in the moment and looks almost comically wrong-headed in hindsight. The network canceled the Lawrence Welk Show, not because the ratings were failing. The program was still drawing substantial audiences. The problem, as far as network executives and advertising agencies were concerned, was the demographic composition of those audiences. Welk's viewers were older, rural, and suburban, not the young urban consumers that Madison Avenue was fixated on delivering. Television was entering a sharper, more cynical era. The rural purge, as television historians have named it, swept away numerous programs that remained genuinely popular, but demographically inconvenient to the network's advertising strategies. Welk's show was canceled alongside Hee Haw, Green Acres, and others, casualties not of audience abandonment, but of boardroom arithmetic. What happened next revealed exactly how thoroughly Lawrence Welk had prepared himself for the possibility that others might try to decide his future for him. Rather than accepting retirement, he built his own production company, the Lawrence Welk Organization, and began reaching out directly to local and independent television stations across the country. By the end of 1971, he had signed syndication agreements with more than 200 broadcasters. He financed the production himself, controlled the advertising relationships himself, and managed the distribution himself. He had constructed, in a matter of months, a parallel television network built entirely around his own program, and he had done it faster than almost anyone in the industry had thought possible. The results embarrassed the executives who had dismissed him. In many markets, the syndicated Lawrence Welk Show outperformed the programming that had replaced it on ABC. The audiences who had supposedly aged out of demographic relevance proved that they were still present, still loyal, and still capable of making their preferences felt. Critics called it a comeback nobody saw coming. What it actually was, as the business records make clear, was the latest chapter in a lifelong pattern. Lawrence Welk being underestimated by people who should have known better, and then quietly proving them wrong. The scrapbooks at North Dakota State University run from 1938 to 1981. The show logs document every program from July 2, 1955 through September 28, 1982, every song performed, every performer who appeared, every arrangement played before the cameras across 31 years of continuous broadcasting. Reading through that archive, what emerges is a portrait of a man who was genuinely shaped by the hardships of his early life in ways that never fully released him. The fear of poverty was real, and it stayed real. The drive to control everything within reach was real. The instinct to present the most acceptable, most polished, most carefully managed version of himself to the public at all times was as deeply ingrained as any musical habit he had ever developed. He had grown up in a world where survival required absolute discipline and the ruthless suppression of vulnerability. He had carried those lessons into a career that made him beloved and wealthy beyond anything that 10-year-old farm boy could have imagined standing in a cold North Dakota field. He was not simple. He was never just the smiling man with the accordion counting off his band with that famous A1 and A2. He was a man who built a fortune while projecting modesty. He was a man who fired a beloved performer over a dispute about pay and let the public believe the story was about a knee. He was a man who kept a black performer employed on national television for 18 years without once making a speech about what that meant, because silence felt safer than acknowledgement, and acknowledgement might have cost him something. He was a man who understood music rights, real estate, syndication, and brand building long before most entertainers had begun to think in those terms. The archives do not reveal a villain. They reveal something far more interesting than that. They reveal how much a person can contain, how much ambition and fear and calculation can live inside a smile, how much history can be compressed into the gap between a public image and a private truth, and how a man who grew up speaking no English in a sod house on the frozen plains of North Dakota can become one of the most enduring and complicated figures in American entertainment history, not in spite of his contradictions, but perhaps, when you look at it honestly, because of them. The bubbles kept rising every Saturday night. The champagne music kept playing, and the story behind it all, as the archives make perfectly clear, was always richer, stranger, and more human than anyone watching at home was ever meant to know.